couple of days after the inauguration of President Donald Trump, we're here at the Royal Elcano Institute to speak about the future of American trade, economic, and international relations policy with one leading expert in the field, Manuel Muñiz. He's director of the Transatlantic Relations program of the Center of International Relations at Harvard's Kennedy School of International Affairs. And the first question is really, well, welcome to the Elcano.
Thank you.
And the first question is, since you just arrived from the US, can you give us a sense of the perception? Is Trump going to be a president that behaves like the candidate? Is he going to be much more, balanced, controlled by the checks and balances in the system? What's your take on that?
Well, I wish I had a definitive answer. I think everybody's asking this question. How is it is clear to everybody now that he's going to behave himself individually very much like the candidate. We're just discussing this before. I think we're going to be on a permanent campaign for the next 4 years. That is the sort of man he is, and that is the sort of life that he's run, also in business and in other places. And you just have to look at what he did at the CIA, right in front of the walls with the stars of all of the fallen of the agency. And he gave it was basically a press conference with a campaign style. He used it to attack the media, to attack his opponents, in one of the most symbolic and emblematic places. So he's going to be using the bully pulpit and the office to continually campaign. In terms of the atmosphere, there are two options here. There are two takes. One is, let's see what he does. The cabinet seems okay. There are good appointments in there, including Rex Tillerson, by the way, who I think is probably going to do a decent job. At least he's had a very successful career, so it's not. I don't think that's as scandalous as some people have portrayed that. I think Mattis is very good. So there's some people in the team that are very good, and the hearings for confirmation are have been very reasonable and positive. But then you have, of course, the take that he's going to be very corrosive and erosive for the institutions. And his first fight is going to be with the media, it seems, and he's picked it, and we've seen this in the last few days. So the big question is, how are the checks and balances going to work? Not just institutionally, the various institutions, but also within his own cabinet and government, because it's now almost evident that the cabinet is going to be much more reasonable than the actual president leading the cabinet. There was an interview that was given by Obama where he said, what was your most important advice to Trump? And he said, this is a job that you can't do alone. So, which is a very subtle way of saying you have to listen to the people around you. Now, whether he's going to listen or not, we just don't know. But there's going to be this tension between this broader narrative of erosion of the checks and balances and some very worrying dynamics and constant campaigning and, very much in sort of like a Berlusconi style, just a constant fight. And then I think the reasonableness and the technocratic nature and quality nature of the cabinet and other institutions within the American system. And nobody knows how that's going to play out, but the tension is going to be there, and it's there from the beginning.
Well, it's clear that it's very difficult to make forecasts, as you've explained. But some people are talking about the end of the liberal economic geopolitical order. Let's start with the geopolitics. What do you think is going to happen? Is this going to go very fast? We're going to need some time to adapt.
Yeah. So I fall on the camp of the optimist regarding the U.S. I think the U.S. has many checks and balances, and I think he's going to be quite constrained domestically with what he can do. It's going to take a very long time to change, for example, the composition of the Supreme Court. I think, there are going to be checks and balances with Congress and with other institutions, with the states, and, even, the judiciary and others. Internationally, I think it's much more worrying because he has a much greater margin of maneuver. It's now evident that he's going to reopen negotiations about NAFTA. I don't think TPP is going to go anywhere. I don't think TTIP has many chances of being passed, at least not in its current form. So regarding trade, he clearly has the margin of maneuver to reopen some of the issues there. In geopolitical terms, I think the Iran deal is something that we have to look very closely at because he has expressed great opposition to this. And so he might also reopen that. The broader trend, though, and what I think is much more worrying, and what I've come here to talk to you guys about, is what happens when you connect all of the dots, not just Trump, but then you connect the far right and also the far left in Europe. All of these anti-establishment parties that are popping up, you connect these trends that have driven very much Brexit, and there's data now that connect some of these events, particularly if you look at the erosion of the middle class in some of these places, and then you actually connect the dots of who's voting for some of these options. So it's the systemic or the structural process that is much more worrying to me, because and Trump might be one of the most significant things or events in that process, but it's an ongoing process. So what happens if you get a far-right government in the Netherlands? What happens if you get a much strengthened alternative for Germany in Germany? Let alone what happens if Marine Le Pen wins in France, which would be, I think, that is really the trump card for the entire architecture, because that would be hitting it, I think, in its weakest point, which is the EU project, right? If you connect all of these dots, then and you look at what's happened in the last, 18 to 24 months, you see that the trend is extremely worrying. We still need a couple of more pieces in the domino to fall. But if they do fall, and it seems that the trends are pushing us in that direction, then we could really be entering a very anti-liberal era, where international trade is going to be questioned, the EU is going to be questioned, regional governance is going to be questioned, cosmopolitanism is going to be questioned, porous borders are going to be questioned. I mean, the whole architecture, to some extent, international law, and you see these commonalities across these movements, right? So that, in my mind, is what really worries me. If I had to say to you what is the most worrying issue right now, I would say it's Europe. So domestically, Trump, I think he's quite limited in what he can do. He's going to undo some things. In Europe, I think he can have a huge impact in weakening the project.
And finally, a brief comment on the economy. He's promised to raise growth to 4%. Tax cuts can be expansionary on the short run, like the infrastructure program could be. Do you see that as being feasible, benefiting his own voters, or just being, a Reaganomics kind of thing that, increases the trade deficit, increases inflation, and brings problems down the road with debt?
Well, I think he might get away with it in the first mandate. So if I had to make a bet right now, and you probably, this is something you shouldn't do, but I think he might get away with a successful first mandate, because he has the fiscal margin and he has the political geometry to get most of these things through, if not in their entirety, or at least as they were planned during the campaign or promised, both the tax cuts and the investments in infrastructure and a few other things. So I think he's going to increase aggregate demand through various channels, mostly through debt. I think he's going to fuel debt. In that sense, I think it's going to be very much like Bush Jr. Mandate, in the sense that the stock of debt by the end of his mandate is going to be, I think, much greater than it is right now in the U.S. But that might generate the feeling of growth. I think we're going to see probably interest rates hikes in the U.S., probably employment going up in various areas and things like that. Now, how sustainable that is and the extent to what that addresses the real underlying issues, which are not precisely creating jobs in low-value sectors like construction and others through debt, but rather what do we do? In my mind, it's not so much about trade and the export of jobs, but what do you do with automation and the redundancy of jobs, and what do we do with skill-biased technological change and inequality? I mean, these are much more structural issues that you do not resolve just through these sorts of investments. Even if he was successful in his policy of bringing back industrial production to the U.S., I don't think that's going to provide jobs in the long run. If you look at the U.S. has been reindustrializing in the last few years. I mean, if you look at industrial output in the U.S., it has been increasing consistently for the past 10 years. What has not increased is industrial jobs. If they're automating industrial production in China, how can he expect to bring back industrial production and jobs in the U.S.? So the answer is perhaps in the short run, in a very unhealthy fashion, through debt, he might bring back growth and jobs. In the long run, I don't think he's going to be addressing the underlying issues. So the big question is, again, and we go back to the longer trends, what comes after Trump?